Well, it's time to take a look at what's making the news on the front pages of the world's newspapers. And joining me to dissect the media headlines is commentator Cornelia Meyer and the journalist Juliana Oladipo. Very good morning to both of you. And first, we're going to actually start with something that's not on the front pages of any of the newspapers that we've got. It's the Saudi Arabia's King Salman has unveiled his cabinet reshuffle. Has there been any surprises there?
There have been no surprises. I mean, he left the key people in. He left the minister Naimi in, who is the oil minister. He left Saud al-Fazl, the foreign minister, in, and he left the finance minister in. So these are the key positions. He is changing over, though, the governorship of the province of Riyadh and the province of Riyadh. And that's actually very important when you think he became king. After having been for 50 years the governor of Riyadh, and then for some years the defense minister. So this is very key, because that is where you deal with the tribes, with the local tribes. So these are key positions, and for him to change them over, that is expected, but probably good.
So we might actually see some changes sort of differing from the previous king.
Yeah, well, the previous king has actually embarked on a remarkably good course of liberalization. A lot of people in the West say, oh, it's been too slow. But when you have a country that's that conservative, you can't go from here to there, you know, in a Ferrari. You probably need a Volkswagen.
Exactly. Well, let's move on now to the front page of our first newspaper, and that is, of course, the China Daily. And Juliana, the main headline there is MH370, the verdict reached, saying that the plane has disappeared and it has been declared an accident.
Yeah, it's a really sad story. I think it's expected. You know, I think because there have been so many other air disasters recently, people have kind of put the MH370 disaster on a back burner, but we did need the answer. So I think the fact that it's been declared an accident was expected, but still there are so many questions that need to be raised. Of course, it's a headline in the China Daily because we know that the majority of the passengers, up to 200 of them, were Chinese. But then I think there are still going to be questions raised. Of course, there are going to be compensation for victims' families. But then, you know, what happened to this plane? I remember with the days and the months after, people were saying, was it terrorism? There were a lot of questions being asked about the pilot. And again, within this story, those questions seem to have been erased, but then they're still obviously going to be in our memories. But then again, it's still a sad day for Malaysia, because we know that there's been so much concerns with their air flying and how they're going to resolve any problems that they do have. But I do think, even though it has been declared an accident, there are still many questions to be answered.
Because it remains one of the greatest aviation mysteries of this day.
Yeah, I think there's two things to be said here. One, it's good for the people because they can get closure. You know, it's now officially they can get closure, which is sad but good. But if I was Malaysian Airlines, I'd be very, and the country of Malaysia, I'd be very worried, because it's sort of not acceptable for a major airline to just lose a plane. You can lose a plane, and, you know, that's very sad, an accident. You know where the fuselage is, you know it. But just to lose it into oblivion, that does not bode well for the professionalism of the airline.
It's very worrying.
And you saw they have a new management in, and it's just not from a business point of view and from the point of view of Malaysia as a place to do business. This is not a good thing.
But it does raise questions about air traffic control, changeovers when flying into different territories and things like that, because in this day and age, anyone can be tracked with their mobile phone or anything, but we can't find an aircraft.
I think, yeah, and I think when, you know, the AirAsia flight was missed, and of course we found the wreckage now, but when it was missing, people were really scared. A lot of people were like, you know, is it safe to fly? You know, you never think that this is going to happen on air. Of course, we know there are dangers. So I think, yeah, there are lessons to be learned, but the lessons haven't been learned quick enough, particularly in Malaysia. But I think, you know, they've spent billions on trying to find this plane, and they said they're still going to keep the search up. But I think, yeah, it's going to raise a lot of questions for the aviation industry as a whole.
And the search is obviously costing a lot of money, as you mentioned. But when do people stop searching?
Well, they have just vowed that they will keep on searching. I think they will try to keep on searching until they found the fuselage and they found the black box. But this is really what makes it so unusual, is that you look at the AirAsia plane, you knew pretty much where it came down, and you knew it. The unusual thing here is, and there I think we have to blame Malaysian Airlines, that they didn't keep track of their plane. And now I used to work for GE on the side of power, you know, of energy. But I know from that time that the aircraft engine manufacturers actually monitor the planes remotely. So the aircraft, the engine manufacturer, if they have a good long-term service contract, would know exactly where the plane is at what place, which tells me also what are they doing for maintenance.
It's going to keep conspiracy theorists talking. For years.
I suppose what it at least does is it now allows people to seek compensation, because before they were left in limbo, there was...
But I don't think you can ever be compensated enough for the loss of a loved one.
But at least, you know, at least there's something, at least closure.
All right, well, let's move on to the next front page now, and that's the independent newspaper in the UK. And I suppose probably the first thing to look at is the snowstorm that hit Britain, the big freeze in the north of the country.
Well, it's something, you know, it's winter. It's something you're definitely going to hear about. It's not yet reached London. I think there's always a big hoo-ha in Britain when there's a bit of snow. Everybody wants it, but when it comes, you know, there's a big disaster. I think what's a bit surprising is that year on year we have the same story. You know, months before the snow comes, we're saying there's going to be snow, there's going to be snow, and then it comes and, you know, we're all in chaos. 300 schools have been closed this morning, and also as well, there's loads of flights that have been cancelled going in and out of Manchester, which is a little bit, you know, it's like, come on, can we not just deal with a little bit of snow? They're able to do it in Finland and Norway and everywhere else. But here...
it's a matter of cost. I mean, if you look at how expensive these snow trucks are for airports, and if you only have a snow event once or twice a year, you're probably not going to spend the 400 or 500 million pounds that it costs. Gatwick did something very intelligent. 2 years ago they were hit, so they said, okay, the guys in Zurich, they're changing over their trucks, they have a lot of snow, so they bought the old trucks. So if I was a British airport, or if I was a British railway, I would go to Finland, Sweden, Switzerland, all of those cold places and say, what of your snow fleet are you retiring, and what discount prices can you get us? Surely we should be able to do that. It's the same thing with we always have, every autumn we have problems with the rails because they're leaves. And it's very amazing that these leaves come every autumn.
I know. It's almost part of the British culture to complain when it's here.
Certainly. Well, the other story that the Independent's looking at is the hard line on immigration could cost the Tories the election.
Wouldn't that be good?
I think it's quite an interesting story here. I live in Newham, which is one of the poorest, most deprived boroughs in the United Kingdom. Very, very many migrants live there. But in my constituency, West Ham, it's a black guy who's running, a Nigerian guy, Festus Akinbusoye, and he's a Tory, and he's got a lot of supporters. I think it's an outdated story. It does make some sense, but a lot of migrants, you know, they work hard. I think I'm not sure exactly that the Tories will suffer. I think migrants generally tend to go towards the left and Labour, but then these days there's very much difference between the two parties.
And of course the Tories, we have to say, are the Conservative Party, the right-wing Conservatives in government.
I think there's another thing. There's another thing. The Tory has markedly shifted to the right because they're worried about UKIP, the UKIP independents, who have this anti-immigration policy. So they've shifted, and it's a little bit like cutting off your nose to spite your face, because yes, if you're in the Cotswolds, which is sort of rural Britain, you know, very picturesque, yes, you have all white people, but if you come to the big agglomerations like London and Bradford, even Scotland, there's a lot of immigrants. Well, I'm one of them. You know, I don't look like one, but I'm one of them. I'm originally Swiss. I'm one of them, and I'm now, and they have lost all standards and given me a British passport. So it's a difficult line to tread, and they still have these old people, you know, these relics of the Thatcher and Major era that are important backbenchers who sort of driving policy probably in the wrong way for the party.
Okay, well, that's just a bit of a look at some of the front pages of the major newspapers. We'll have you both back a little bit later on This Day Live to look at a few of the other stories. Cornelia, Meyer and Juliana Oladipo, thank you very much for talking to us. Well, time for another look at the papers, and welcome back to media commentator Cornelia Meyer and the journalist Juliana Oladipo. Welcome back to you both. Now, we're going to start with the Wall Street Journal's Europe edition, and there's plenty happening there. We might start with their main headline, Bets Against Small Currency. Pegs rise. So there's a little bit of action going on there with people hedging their bets on what's going to happen with currencies.
Yes, and that's actually it's interesting because the Swiss had a floor to the euro or to the euro, and they said it would last 3 years, and it lasted 3 years, and everybody was surprised it only lasted 3 years, and so they get off. And as the euro is going ever lower and the dollar is going ever higher for other currencies like the Danish krone, which is pegged to the euro, or the Arab currencies, which are pegged to the dollar. This is getting difficult, and we need to abstract that and put this in. What does that mean? It means that if you are a company and you produce things, suddenly when you want to export, your produce becomes 20% more expensive, and then you employ people, so maybe you have to start firing people. So it has real impact on the economy, and that's also currencies like Naira, who is de facto pegged to the dollar. It's an important thing, because if suddenly, you as a producer, it's nice if you suddenly become richer, if you're a tourist.
Very few, isn't it? Yeah.
If you're a tourist, but if you have to think of what does it mean for employment in a country.
This is the problem we're having with the Naira now. For example, it's 300 Naira to a pound. Are not able to fend for their lives. Unfortunately, in situations like this, of course, Switzerland is a very wealthy country, but in the less wealthy regions, again, when it comes to the economy, it's always the people that need it the most that are struggling.
Yeah. And what I find what I find so difficult, which I also find with commodities, is the speculators that go in and place bets. And so suddenly, if it was a 10%, if a 10% fluctuation, it becomes a 30% fluctuation, because of all of the speculative money in there. And I think that's where the central banks of the world should really work together to get some legislation through against speculators. Because
it's the speculation that really hurts, because people think, oh, I'll buy all of that, that goes up, and then...
It's the same with the oil price, or more so with food prices, So when it goes up, suddenly it goes up much more. When it comes down, it suddenly comes down much more, and it distorts the market. And again, as you said, it's the poorer people who suffer.
Also on the Wall Street Journal, we've got the European Parliament President meeting the new Greek Prime Minister. Do you think that Alex Tsipras has really toned down his rhetoric since that we heard before the election?
Of course, I think that's typical of all politicians in all situations, but it's extremely important with Greece. I think what's happened with Greece since they've had to agree with the terms that the IMF have set is that, the middle class have literally been wiped out. There have been mass suicides. People have not been able to go to school, not being able to eat. So it's really affected them. And I think, he had no other option but in his, pre-election rhetoric to say, he's going to turn things around and make everything better. But it's not just going to work overnight. And also as well, Greece do not want to be pulled out of the EU zone. So I think it's very good, and it's very important, not just for Europe, because all eyes are on it, it's for the world, for Greece to say, OK, we're going to back down and we're going to come to some terms, but then we're not sure exactly how it's going to pan out.
Well, it's interesting, because also he's in a coalition, so that makes it always, as we know in this country, it always makes it more difficult. But, there is so much, they have had two very generous bailout programs from the Troika, the EU, the ECB, and the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, and you can't just renege on those. They do not want to get themselves, as you rightly said, out of the euro. He said that even in the thing. So nothing has. There's a nice saying, the soup is never eaten as hot as it is cooked. But what is interesting, which leads to the next story in here, is that they're being quite tough on the stance, saying Russia is a critical relationship, which it is, because there's a lot of Russian investment in Greece. So they're not as hot on sanctions for Russia as the rest of the EU is. And I think that is where we will see the big battlefront.
That's going to be a very tough negotiating time within
Russia,
Europe.
they're in no terms to negotiate right now, are they? Especially with Europe and America because of all the sanctions.
Yeah, and the Greeks will say, if the Russians and if Europe wants to up the sanctions, they've now decided to stick with the sanctions. If they want to up them, they need the Greeks' approval because they're part of the EU 28.
But also, it hurts. While it does hurt Russia, Europe also hurts from these sanctions as well.
It hurts Europe, and if you look at the Spanish and the German dairy producers, the Spanish fruit and vegetable producers were hurt because then there were the counter sanctions by the German economy is hurt because it's so integrated with the Russian economy on the oil and gas front and the chemicals front. They all get all the Russian gas. And you see it's bad for the Russian economy, but you see entrepreneurship coming up exactly in agriculture. So Russian agriculture is actually starting to be a hip place to be in if you're an entrepreneur.
Certainly, and it's going to be very interesting to see what exactly happens over the next few weeks and months. It's been great to talk to you both, Cornelia Meyer and Juliana Oladipo. Thanks very much for your insights.
Thanks.